Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today, we are going to study Ezekiel, that's the prophet Ezekiel, chapter 5. We just learned in chapter 4 of a series of symbolic acts that God asked Ezekiel, the prophet, to do. The purpose being to convey a message to the people. And God had told Ezekiel, I don't want you to be the one that gives the speech, so to speak. I don't want you to be the one that talks to the people, but rather I want you to convey the message in the words and in the manner in which, I tell you to do it. So God gave him a series of actions that he wanted Ezekiel to do. The first one was to build almost like a panorama of representing the siege of Jerusalem with a brick, with the engraving in the shape of the city of Jerusalem on it, and setting up siege walls and soldiers around it and so on, to lie down on his side for many years, representing the amount of time that the Jewish people were sinning and causing the suffering to come, to eat only a very limited amount of a very specific type of bread, and then to cook it over feces, which represents the worsening starvation and disease of the people while they were under siege. And then we are about to study a fifth symbolic act that God is going to ask Ezekiel to do. So this seems to be going in some sort of a chronological order, where the enemy comes. The enemy comes because of the people's sins. The siege gets worse and worse, and the people start to get hungry. Now is the worst part. The city falls, and this is how God wants him to symbolize that. Presumably, while he's lying down, his hair is growing very long. V'atov en adam, and you, human being, God says to Ezekiel, Kach lecha, take cherev chada, a sharp knife, take a razor. Ta'ar hagalavim tikochen alach, take the kind of razor that would be used by a barber to shave someone. Take it for yourself, and use it on your head and on your beard. And take for yourself mozne mishkal v'chilaktam. Take scales and put your hairs in different piles. And when you do this, shilishit ba'or tav'ir b'socha'ir, a third of the hair that you remove, burn it inside the city that you set up in your model of the city under siege. Burn it within the city. Kimlos yimei hamatzar, which will represent when the city, the end of the siege. V'lokachto es hashlishit and take a third and spread the hair around the city and strike it with the sword, presumably that razor blade that you're using. And the other third, scatter it around in the wind, and then unsheath a sword after and chase after the hair, or wave the sword after the hair as it blows away, representing the third of the people who will be destroyed by fire, meaning destroyed by the war and the destruction of the city. A third will be struck by in other words, that third will be the fire of most commentaries understand the fire of starvation. One third by sword, by the destruction, and the other third will be scattered into exile. But even as they're running into exile, the enemy is still chasing them. And from the remaining third that you were scattering, keep some of them, and kind of tuck them into your clothing. And from those, otikach, so those are the ones that escape the enemy and get to some place of at least relative safety. But even those that get there, take from those and throw them into the fire, because some of those people might get to a safer destination and get away from the enemy, but they'll still be subjected to starvation. Burn them in flames. From here, presumably from this, meaning from from the destruction of Jerusalem will come a fire that comes and destroys all of Israel, even many of those that escape. So what's represented here is only a few are going to be left tucked in various scattered places around the world. This is the end of verse 4. So this series of 5 symbols is a demonstration of the terrible destruction that God is about to place upon Israel. In verse 5, Ko Amar Adonai Elohim, so says God, Zos Yerushalayim, this city of Jerusalem. B'soch hagoyim samtiya, I placed her among the other nations. Usvivoseh haratzos, and surrounding Jerusalem were many other lands. Jerusalem was supposed to be, now we've emphasized this throughout the prophets, Isaiah, throughout Jeremiah and the other prophets. The idea was that Jerusalem was supposed to set an example and be different. It wasn't just supposed to be just another nation with just another pagan god to worship, and that god happens to be God and happens to have a temple who happens to have this and this and this as the way he's worshipped. It was supposed to be something different. It was supposed to be an example that God actually wants our behavior. He wants us to be just, to perform acts of justice and righteousness. He wants us to actually be good, to set an example for the rest of the world that this is different. This God is just not just another one among many, but he is the God, the creator of the world, the one who wants all of us together to serve and worship him by living moral, just, ethical lives. However, Vatemer et mishpatai, they rebelled against, she, meaning Jerusalem, or the people of Jerusalem rebelled against my laws. Lirishon min hagoyim, to the extent that she became even worse than the other nations. To some degree, they may have actually been worse in many cases than the other nations, maybe been more immoral. But also, even if they did the same thing as the other nations on a significant level, that makes them worse because they knew better and they had access to the truth. Pietru kosai, and she rebelled against my my laws, my rules. Min haratzos asher v'sivoseh, even more than the lands that surrounded her. Ki v'mishpatai ma'asu. Here God gives us a hint, not so much because they were actually worse, but because it was mishpatai ma'asu. They had my laws, and they made them disgusting. They didn't keep them. In other words, they were they didn't keep those laws. V'chu kosai lo hachu b'hem. They had my rules. They had my my guidance, but they did not go on that path. Lo halchu b'hem, they did not go. Lachein, therefore, this is verse 7. Therefore, Ko Amar Adonai Elohim, so says God, Yan hamonchem min hagoyim, because asher tzvivosechem, because you have done even worse than the nations that surrounded you, because b'chukosai lo halachtem v'yet mishpatai lo asisem, because you did not do my rules. You had my rules, you had my laws, you had the Torah, but you did not go that way, you did not do that. And even worse, you did not even do like the laws of the nations that were around you. And Rashi points out, as the rabbis point out of the Talmud or in the Gemara, that it says that kimesukanim there were many around you that did behave well, that did act properly. You did not do like those, but rather you chose to go in the paths of the corrupt ones, of the evil ones. Therefore, verse 8, God says, Ko Amar Adonai Elohim, so says God, Hineni alayach gamoni, I am going to come against you. I will bring judgment upon you in the eyes of all the nations. And we'll see in many times in this book, and we've seen before, the idea that the people thought that God would never destroy his temple because it would be embarrassing to God, it would be a shame on God. The whole world will say, look, what happened to God in his temple? That God is nothing. Our God is the real God because our temple is still standing. People thought that God would never do that, but what they didn't understand was that the true God, his honor doesn't come from temples. It doesn't come from sacrifices or rituals. Honor of God comes from keeping the laws and the rules that he gives to us, the laws of justice, the laws of mishpatim, the laws of justice. But God says, instead, I am going to take justice out against you, and that is how I am going to be recognized in the world. I am going to destroy among you things that I have not done. This is, and that I will never do again. In other words, the destruction of Jerusalem will be such a terrible act and such a terrible suffering that I will not do it again, Yan Kol To'avosach, because of all of the disgusting things you have done. This is a word that Ezekiel is going to repeat many times. It's sometimes translated abominations, but these are because of the disgusting abominations and terrible sins that you committed. I am going to come against you in a way that no one has ever done before. L'chein, therefore, and this is one of the most awful verses to read. I'm going to read it, and I'm not going to talk much about it, and we'll move on. L'chein, therefore, avos yochlu vanim b'tochech, the curses that were written in the Torah, that parents will be starving, that they'll eat the bodies of their children. Vanim yochlu abosam, and children will eat the bodies of their parents. V'asisi v'chosh fatim, I will do among you justice. V'zevisi es kol she'erisayach chol haruach, and I will spread out the remnants of you to all directions of the world, of course being symbolized by the hair. Presumably these are words that God wants Yechezkel to speak as he does these actions, the symbolic acts which we just discussed before. Verse 11, L'chein, therefore, Chai ani nom Adonai Elohim, God swears, Im lo yanes mikdashai timeis, if because of the fact that you ruined my temple, you defiled my temple, b'chol shikutzayach, with all of the disgusting things of b'chol ta'avosayach, and all of the abominations that you committed in my temple, or not necessarily in my temple, but also that you committed in the name of me in my temple. V'gam ani agra, I am also going to reap my payment. V'lo sachoseini, I will not have mercy on you. V'gam ani lo achmol, I will have no compassion on you, and I will punish you. Shlishiseich badever yamusu. Remember, this is still the speech that God is telling Yechezkel the prophet to say to the people when he does these symbolic acts, completing with the act of the hair. A third of you will die in plague, uvarav, and in hunger, yichlu b'sochech, will destroy among you. V'ashlishis, and a third of you, b'cherer v'iplu sviv v'sarach, will fall by the sword. V'ashlishis, and the other third, the chol ruach ezoreh, I'm going to scatter in all directions of the world. V'cherer v'rik acharhem, and I'm going to have swords chasing after them. V'chola apiva ani chasicham mesivam v'hinachamti. We had a slight silver lining before. In verse before, where God said, I will never do this again, God says over here, also, I will do this, but it will be over. I will at some point say, it's enough. V'yadu'u, and the world will know, Ki ani Adonai, that I am God, because I did make a covenant with this people. I did ask them to be with me forever, and I promise to be with them forever, and I will save a remnant of the people, and they will come back. And they will know that it is me. I am the God that spoke. It's me, not the temple, not the buildings, not the rituals, but me, God. Dibarti b'kenasi, I spoke when I was angry. B'chalosi chamasibam, when I completed my anger. In other words, when I emptied my anger upon them. It is you that will be ashamed, and not me. Don't worry about me being ashamed that my temple is gone. I'm not worried about that. But you, the people, are going to be the ones that are going to be ruined and ashamed. Among those nations that are around you, in the eyes of all the people that pass by, you're the ones that will be ashamed. Verse 15, your shame will be a musar, will be something that people will learn from. Umishama, and you will be like a wonder, like people will look like in awe of the terrible suffering that you have. Like to the nations that are around you. When I take out my justice against you, with in anger and fury, and the punishments of another word, chema, for fury and anger. Ani Adonai dibarti, it is I, God, that has spoken. B'shalchiat chitzei harav, when I sent the arrows of hunger and starvation, haraim bohem, asher hayulim ashchis, for those against those that are doomed, asher hayu, that are set aside, l'mashchis, to be destroyed. That third that were set aside to be destroyed, asher shalach osam l'shachaschem, that I have sent those arrows of hunger against them to destroy them. V'ra'avo seif alechem, I will add hunger upon you. This seems to be referring to those that ran away. I'll add even more hunger, because many of those will die from hunger, as we saw a few verses ago. V'shavarti lachem atelachem, and I will break from you the staff of bread. In other words, bread represents all of food and sustenance. I will break that. You will not have anything to sustain yourselves. 17, V'shilachti alechem ra'av, I will send against you starvation, v'chaya ra'ah, and animals will come to attack you, v'shikluch, and they will cause you to lose your family, your children, v'dever, v'dam v'yavarbach, and blood and pestilence will pass among you. I'll bring sword against you. Ani Adonai dibarti, I am God who spoke. This is a very terrible, very terrible chapter. One of the worst and most dismal, and most depressing chapters in Ezekiel, and possibly in all of the Tanakh. Just really quick, I'm just going to go back really fast. V'chala api, I'm going to go back to verse 13. V'hine chamti, I will be comforted. Not comforted is not the right word. I will change. In other words, I will be done. This is an end. It is terrible. It is awful beyond words, beyond description. But God has repeated at least twice in this chapter that this is something that will be over, something that will end, and He will rebuild that relationship. Thank you so much for studying chapter 5 with me. Looking forward to moving on to chapter 6. I'm sorry to tell you that in the first of the 3 sections, like I said in the introduction, of Ezekiel is unfortunately about the destruction, so there are some depressing parts, but don't worry, the whole book of Ezekiel is not like that. If we stick with this, we will get there. Thank you so much. Looking forward to studying chapter 6 together.